Hello, I'm Meshal Malik and welcome to Indus Special. The importance of architecture cannot be emphasized enough. Iconic buildings and structures are the soul of a city. The well-being of communities is contingent upon how the town is planned. The safety of a family within their home depends on how the house has been constructed. And then comes the importance of architecture in light of human evolution. Forts and towers, mosques and churches are relics of the past, symbols of a civilization that existed. Today we will discuss how architecture has evolved through the ages and how exactly it influences our lives today. Joining us for this discussion is Mariam, who is joining us in the studios. She's an architect who specializes in historic preservation. Also joining us is Ratish Nanda, who is a conservation architect and who is also the project's director of Aga Khan Trust for Culture. Thank you both for joining us. Ratish, I'd like to begin with you. So I was talking about how architecture is a relic of the past, how it encompasses so much culture and heritage. But you work a lot in terms of restoration, preservation. Why exactly is that important?
Well, I think like everything else, architecture is the sort of culmination of thousands and thousands of years of building traditions, thousands and thousands of years of knowledge that our forefathers have, generated, created, and which allowed till very recent times for us to have a meaningful life in the buildings that we built. You know, they were thermally efficient. They instilled nice emotional feelings. They inspired us to be happy and so on. And for us to keep the historic buildings or restore the historic buildings is not only important for the sake of preserving our past, but also ensuring pride in community and ensuring that the knowledge contained in these buildings is passed on to future generations.
So you're talking about how it's important for community building. What do you think it does for the community when a restoration project takes place? Because I'm sure it's not just about the building then.
Well, I think what we at the Aga Khan Trust for Culture have been demonstrating both in Pakistan and India is that historic building preservation fulfills a lot of government agendas. It not only does it improve quality of life by improving urban spaces, it also leads to significant employment creation. It leads to significant economic returns through tourism, but also through use of local materials and local craftsmanship. It helps us understand who we really are, which is very important if we are going to move forward in a sustainable manner or develop or so on.
Ratish, and that's a very interesting point that you're saying it really helps us understand who we really are. And I'd like to take this question to Mariam here. How do you think it helps understand who we really are?
I think because it's a part of our shared identity and, it's our history and we come from it. And unfortunately, nowadays, it's so isolated that we don't even look at it. A lot of people don't even know that these monuments exist, that these communities exist. But they're a part of our shared identity. And I think that's very important to remember, that in order for us to move forward, we have to keep the past in our radar. We have to remember what it was and how we've evolved into who we are today.
Do you think with the increasing pressures of globalization, this need to preserve, to restore has been amplified?
Well, in developing country context, it's a fairly new concept now because there are so many other issues that require more attention that historic preservation is not getting the kind of focus or energy that it needs. But, organizations such as the Aga Khan Trust for Culture have been working in the Indian subcontinent for quite a while now. And I think that the projects that they've taken part in kind of show the benefits of historic preservation, the large-scale benefits of historic preservation. And it's not just limited to the community that's living around those projects, but also the general national identity that we face, right? So apart from people who are living in the community and they know that these buildings are there, it instills a sense of pride in them.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it has a lot of socioeconomic benefits. Like Ratish said, it creates a lot of jobs. It brings a lot of tourism. So it has a lot of national, not just regional, not just local, but a lot of national benefits to offer.
And with that, I also want to ask Ratish on a similar point. So you were also in charge of the restoration project in Kabul for a park. And from a previous interview, you stated that there was a lot of resistance against it because people didn't see the point of that restoration project. How do you see that now?
Well, you see, what you're talking about, the Baghe Babur. Now, the Baghe Babur is a park which was built in 1505 by the Mughal Emperor Babur. And almost immediately after it was possible to work in Afghanistan, we at the Aga Khan Trust for Culture moved in and started restoring the garden. At which point, I mean, of course, the community had been through 2 decades of civil war and said, no, we don't need a restoration of a garden. We don't even need a garden. We need schools, we need hospitals, and rightly so. Today, the Baghe Babur is visited by more than 30,000 people every week. So it's an oasis. It's as much part of the healing process in Afghanistan as any school or hospital would have been. It's the refuge for the people of Kabul to really go and sit under a tree and picnic. And I think that has demonstrated itself. And Baghe Babur is not only the major tourist attraction for visiting dignitaries in Afghanistan, but it is also self-sustaining. So for us, again, it's very important in our part of the world, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, to demonstrate that our heritage is not a burden. It's not something that we have to. It's an economic asset that not only can it pay for itself, but it can also generate significant revenue for other objectives of the government.
Definitely. And Ratish, something that you mentioned here, which was very intriguing, was the healing process involved when you restore buildings. And in context of that, when we talk about India and Pakistan, we have a colonial history. And of course, before that, the Mughal civilization had great architecture. But after that, also, architecture was influenced by the British. So how would you give precedence to which, because both of them are a part of our history. So how do we pick and choose which restoration processes to focus on? Do we try to decolonize our past? Do we try to revert back? What do we do in that case?
Well, I think what is important is that every piece of architecture, which is whether it's going back to Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, or as recently as the colonial buildings, I think we need to draw lessons in from every civilization and every era and adopt those lessons to our buildings today. Unfortunately, what's happened in the 20th century is because of advent of materials like glass, cement, steel, we are forgetting the principles of our architectural traditions, and our spaces are becoming alien to our own civilization. As a result, you're dealing with neighborhoods who are not interacting with each other. As a result, you're leading to health issues because of the lack of open space and ventilation, and so on. So I think what is important is not to really, every period, whether it's Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Mughals, or even the colonial time, is very much a part of history and cannot be forgotten or cannot be done away with. I think what is important is lessons from every period, whether it's design of open spaces, whether it's living standards, whether it's thermal efficiency, need to be adapted to our buildings of the 21st century.
Yeah, and Ratish, you're alluding towards the conundrum of trying to reconcile our heritage with the modernization process. And with that, I want to take that question to Mariam. How difficult is that to do? The rise in population, with how urban planning is changing, how do we do that? How do we adopt those traditional aspects?
So I think, generally speaking, in the context of Pakistan, there needs to be a rigorous debate about, what constitutes as tradition versus modernity, because it's always, we have this understanding that modernity is doing away with tradition altogether.
Yeah.
So the absence of tradition is modern, but tradition is looked at as something that is of the past and should not be brought forward. And I think that's a very wrong way to go about it. There are good things in both those concepts, and they both have things to offer. I think architects, academics, everybody needs to have a dialogue about this. Especially this needs to be brought up in architecture schools, to students who are going to be the architects of tomorrow. They need to understand that this is something that exists, it's a problem, and there needs to be a debate about it in order to move forward.
Yeah, so you're talking about this debate, and another debate that comes up when we talk about conservation is the restoration versus mere preservation. So what can you tell us about that?
So I think, every building has a history, it has a journey, it goes through a time period, and in that time period, a lot of things happen. And that's the building's narrative. And I think you cannot restore a building to what it was originally. You have to kind of tell the building's story through the preservation of that building. That's, you can see that in projects that have taken place in Lahore, for example. You can see the Shahi Hammam, or you can see other projects. So it's not about going back to a certain period of time. It's about learning from the changes that occurred. It's about learning from where it originated and how it changed to what it is today. And I think in that respect, there needs to be a conversation about, the adaptive reuse of buildings, because we have a huge building stock which is currently abandoned. And these are all lost opportunities, and there is a way to preserve them, there is a way to restore them, there is a way to adaptively reuse them to current uses so that it can be used by the public and reintegrated into the built environment.
Yeah, that's a very good point. But I also want to hear Ratish's view on that. Please tell us.
Well, you're right that there needs to be a lot more discussion about what's happening. And I think conservation is something that the Mughal emperors and even before them were actively doing. People were repairing buildings built by their forefathers and so on. And the conservation, as we now understand, is, however, a colonial learning. And the British learned a lot of conservation in Pakistan and India before doing similar work in Europe. So a lot of the early experimentation happened here. But just to take off from your question, any large conservation project will have different degrees of intervention. It's like medicine. Sometimes the doctor will tell you, just lie down, take care of yourself, and you'll be fine. And that's preservation. And sometimes you need intensive surgery, and that is almost restoration. So almost every major conservation project will have some preservation, some reconstruction, some restoration. It's unfortunate that in the Indian subcontinent, and obviously so in the Pakistani subcontinent area, this restoration is misunderstood. There is absolutely no reason to do so, especially because our craftsmen can still work with the traditional material, the traditional building techniques, and in ways that their forefathers did 500 years ago. So we should not shy away from what the building needs, whether it's restoration or reconstruction.
And Ratish, you have been involved in several remarkable projects, from restoring Humayun's tomb and the gardens around it. What I want to ask is that you mentioned how the buildings teach us. You personally, what did you learn through these restoration projects?
Far too much. Every day is a learning process. The lessons, unfortunately in India, architects in the pre-British era did not really make drawings. These were master craftsmen who built on site. And it's amazing how these buildings are much more humane than in our buildings. How we all feel much happier going to Shalimar Bagh than we would going to a municipal park, So how do these buildings meet the sky, for example? How do they meet the earth? What is that level of detail? That good personal touch that comes into a building. Because architecture in the Indian subcontinent was something that people did for themselves. People, together with the village, built your own house. And I think that act of personalization of architecture was very important. It's remarkable how these buildings are still standing tall 500 years after they were building, and puts us to shame for our modern buildings, which sort of start crumbling 3 days after you move into them. Look at the madrasas. Look at the historic madrasas. I mean, how much more fun it was to learn in a madrasa environment than it is in a modern school. So I think we architects need to learn a lot more from our historic buildings.
And Ratish, building on to your experiences, I'm really curious to know some of the architectural marvels you came across and which one really astounded you.
Well, I come across an architectural marvel every day. We're very fortunate to be living where we do, where there is so much heritage. But I mean, I've been fascinated by Mughal architecture, and I know there is a lot more on the other side of the border, which I would love to wander around for many, many months someday. But these, as Mariam said, this is a shared heritage, and I would love to aspire for a day, for example, when Babur's tomb in Kabul, Jahangir's tomb in Shahdara in Lahore, Akbar's tomb in Sikandra are all proposed to UNESCO as a single World Heritage nomination by Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India. Our culture has the power to once again unite us, and that is the real dream.
Definitely. This shared heritage must be appreciated, and we must think of it as being something that transcends boundaries. Ratish, on that experience, I also want to get Mariam's opinion on her experiences. So what intrigues you about Mughal architecture, about the past? And can you tell us about something that was way ahead of the time, preserved in those buildings?
I think Mughal architecture just generally is a marvel to begin with, because you look at the way that those buildings were made, whether it was construction-wise, whether it was aesthetically through the fresco work that you see or the glazed tile work that you see, whether you look at the geometries, whether you look at the way that they were laid out and how they were so closely intertwined with their environments, whether it's bringing in the greenery into their spaces, or how those spaces were built for interaction. I think it's just amazing, and just like Ratish said, I've been very fortunate to be around these buildings for a long time now, and it's very enjoyable working in these environments, because it's a learning curve. You learn every day.
And something that you mentioned were the various aspects of these buildings, and I want to ask Ratish before we let him go, is we admire Mughal architecture specifically for its aesthetics, but what utility was involved in it, and what can we learn from that utility present in our modern architecture today?
I think we need to understand Mughal architecture in the larger context. I mean, just taking the walled city of Lahore, for example. The Mughals took a lot of effort to make sure that the streets were narrow. Because the hot climate of Lahore did not want the sun to come all the way down. The street pattern was such that the wind was flowing through the rooms and through the city. So ventilation is very critical. And then, of course, the material and how it was used, sandstone, white marble, these are incredible materials that the Mughals used with utmost grace. And, we are today in India sadly using these materials on stone pavements because it's easier to take them out, which is a pity. But I think more than anything else, what the Mughals were doing was assimilating culture of the places they were building. So in cities like Burhanpur in India, they were building, like in Iran, with lots of aqueducts and water. At Humayun's tomb, they incorporated elements of Hindu architecture, such as the Chhatris, which are really Rajput funerary architecture, and the Kalash. So they were assimilating local traditions. It was a very pluralistic tradition, and their buildings were thermally efficient. You would not feel hot inside a Mughal building even during the peak of the summer, because the wind movement was such. And the lessons are endless, but also spatial planning. I mean, Shahjahanabad in Delhi was a garden city. It was really full of gardens. And the Mughals were almost nomadic because they were constantly on the move. So the Red Fort and all of these fortifications were mainly gardens in stone. And we've sadly over the last 100 years lost those lessons, and it's very encouraging to see architects now beginning to understand these in greater detail and incorporating some of these elements into their building. I mean, look at Humayun's tomb. There is no ornamentation, but the play of red and white lends it great splendor.
And Ratish, I hear the admiration in your voice, the sheer passion. And I wonder, when you look at modern architecture now, what do you think of it?
I try not to look at modern architecture.
That bad?
No, I mean, it's unfortunate. You see, the architecture is meant to give people a great life. And unfortunately, what's happening with modern architecture is a lot of it is leading to disease. And you don't want that. You want architecture to provide a setting for a great quality of life.
That's a brilliant point to end our conversation with Ratish. Nanda, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we're going to continue this discussion. Welcome back to Indus Special. We continue our discussion, and now we're joined by Kamil Mumtaz Khan, who is one of the most renowned architects of Pakistan. He has served as the head of architecture at National College of Arts and is also the founding member of the Lahore Conservation Society. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Kamil. Mr. Kamil, I'd like to begin our discussion with how architectural imagination has evolved from the past to the present.
Well, I am not sure if architectural imagination is a living organism that can evolve. It is human imagination. And what humans imagine is a matter of what they aspire to. And the human imagination has shifted from focused on the metaphysical to the earth, the physical, and now it has gone through the bottom and it is focused entirely on the ego.
That's a very interesting way to put it. So do you think that with that, letting go of the metaphysical spirit and soul of architecture and moving towards a more pragmatic view of architecture, we're losing out on something?
We're absolutely losing out because we have lost focus of who we are, where we are coming from, where we want to go. And as I said, our focus has shifted from knowing that we are from the Creator on this physical world, and we have to return to that source. That is what defined the imagination and aspirations of where we want to go. We are now way past the modern era. The modern era imagined that its only reality was the physical, and so it set its goals and targets horizontally on the worldly plane. But now, in this post-modern era, we don't believe in any reality other than our own internal psychic reality.
And Mr. Kamil, how does that translate into architecture? The postmodern era that we're living in, how does that come into the form of architecture?
Well, architecture, quite frankly, to put it very briefly, has moved from being based on, as I said, a metaphysical ideal to rooted in logic, science, rationalism, function. It has now become a spectacle. So that's the big shift.
So do you think the rationality aspect that you're talking about, and do you think we've compromised on it in terms of how we have forgotten architecture, the architecture we're constructing being rooted in our cultural context and focusing on adopting ideas?
Well, absolutely. There's no question about it. I'm sorry, I've lost your question, actually.
The question I was asking was that, do you think the context of our society, that's how we developed architecture previously, but now we're just adopting models from the Western world or from spheres outside of our context?
Well, yes. If you like to put it that way, in pre-modern times, our experience and sources of inspiration were limited.
Yeah.
With the modern world, we became more conscious of a larger community, man with a capital M. That became an ideal which replaced God. And today, we don't have any ideals. It's politically incorrect to hold any ideology. So there is no right or wrong. Anything goes.
And I'd like to take that question to Mariam. Do you think that architecture today has a layer of superficiality?
Definitely, because I mean, in Pakistan especially, if you look at our historic buildings, our past buildings, and the buildings of today, there's a huge disconnect between the two. You can't really see how that has transformed into what you see today. And I think that leads to a loss of identity, and people don't know where to go, where to turn to for inspiration, which is why they look at magazines or they look at the internet sources, you know, and they look at what could be built. And that's why you find residential houses nowadays with Roman columns, Roman pillars, because we've forgotten, as a people, we've forgotten what our traditional architecture was like and how to translate that into our so-called modern architecture.
So both of you are talking about something very spiritual, something to do with identity, and I'd like to expound upon this idea, because architecture is always seen as something very physical. No one really goes into the depth of trying to understand how it affects us as humans. Mr. Kamil, please elaborate on that.
Well, architecture, let's not forget, is the art of building. So it's the building part which is physical, technical, concrete. When we talk about architecture, what makes the difference is the art. And like every art, it is communicating a message, a content, a concept, an idea. So, and essentially, like all art, the function and purpose of art in society is to represent, to present, to reflect what is really reality. And as I said, now for us, it's architecture has become bankrupt. I mean, there is no basis for making forms. From the traditional unquestioned acceptance of ideal prototypes, archetypes that one had to keep within rules, to the modern, where the belief that forms we will create and invent on the basis of function and materials. Now, in the postmodern era, there is no real basis on what you make. Why should you make? But we're obsessed with form making, but we don't know what should be the basis of making forms.
Yeah.
So we're just trying to invent the most crazy sort of thing, as long as, you know, all that we're interested in is the wow factor.
So do you think we're elevating our architecture, or not even architecture, but do you think the way we're conceiving architecture is more along the lines of creativity as opposed to practicality?
Yes, you might put it like this, but creativity, I mean, what an absolutely amazing, to imagine that we can create anything is so absurd, but we are convinced that it is we who are going to create. We create things. We are going to create a new world. So we're obsessed with innovation, novelty, creativity, something new. And it's only because we feel that with something new, we will come with a bang, we'll impress people. And there's some kind of belief that everything new is a step forward, it's better, progress. The whole of modernity is based on this idea of unending, one-way progress, evolution, development.
And Mariam, building on to something that Mr. Kamil said here, do you think innovation in architecture is somehow harming us? Of course, in the metaphysical sense and in the spiritual sense, of course, it's eroding certain values. But what about, we were talking earlier about how it's leading to diseases. So can you tell us about that?
So I think, this whole conversation about sustainable architecture and, moving forward, having eco-friendly buildings and, how can we look at our environment, our communities better. I think historic preservation and our existing environment right now, existing built environment, plays a very central role in that conversation because it is widely believed, and I quote here, that the greenest building is the building that has already been made, that is already standing. So the idea is that, when you construct new buildings with the idea that they're going to be eco-friendly, it's going to take at least 50 or 80 years for you to make up for that energy that has gone into constructing that building. But the buildings that are already standing, and so many of them are abandoned on Mall Road, or if you go into the Walled City, or so many other historic places in Lahore, these are all, like I said, lost opportunities, and these are buildings that can be renovated, that can be, based on obviously their own traditional materials.
And Mariam, something that you mentioned here was green architecture, and I'd like to pick up on that point a little more. So what do you exactly mean by green architecture, and how can modern buildings try to integrate that aspect?
Right. So I think when we say green, we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about, the kind of impact that it's going to have on the environment, the kind of impact that it's going to have on the communities, on the users of that building. And I think that it's very important to bring everything into perspective and see what exactly we mean by these terms, and how are we bringing that into our new architecture, and how are we preserving the old and making sure that that too is sustainable. Like Ratish mentioned earlier, there's so many aspects of historic architecture, whether it's Mughal, whether it's, you pick apart another era's buildings. There's so many things to learn from that in terms of how, for example, Mughal architecture brought in greenery into their buildings, that could be seen as an eco-friendly sort of thing. And these are things which our modern architecture does not kind of bring into discussion. It does not think about these things. It's about creating things made out of concrete, and the whole idea is moving very further away from who we are, where we've come from, and how we've evolved.
And on that point, I'd like to ask Mr. Kamil about his own designs. Now, they seem to be rooted in traditional values. And you mentioned previously something along the lines that art sends out a message. Through your designs, what message are you sending out?
Well, let's get to a very fundamental point first. The trouble, all these troubles that we're referring to, began when we started to think that nature was something not quite right about it, including human beings. So the day we started trying to improve nature, to improve human beings, human society, that's where we started to really destroy everything. So, of course, in every age, as I said, all art, including architecture, is rooted in what you want to say. And what we want to say with our buildings is what all cultures have always tried to say through their art. And that is to take us beyond the apparent surface, what we think is real, go beyond that to a higher reality that lies beyond. That is the whole design project.
Yeah. We're also joined by Asad Aye Khan, who's the chairman of Pakistan Council of Architects and Town Planners. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Asad. Mr. Asad, in this conversation of how we're moving beyond our traditional values, something I want to ask you, and since you're involved in large projects, how is this concrete jungle we're surrounded by, how is it supposed to integrate nature, and if, in your opinion, that's necessary to do?
I think it's absolutely necessary, and I think the one way of doing it is to have conscientious architects get involved with city planning, and that's pretty lacking at the moment in Pakistan. In fact, even the town planners and architects who are really responsible for in the building control departments of the various development authorities are not, I would say, probably the elite architects who are actually thinking in those lines, but mostly I think we're just following bylaws which are very restrictive. I think our bylaws are very critical that need to be addressed and changed by architects like Kamil Khan Sahab and a lot of other architects who really know what our architecture is all about and what it should be. We are completely following patterns and designs which are not, actually meant for our climate, not meant for our country, but we're just doing what is being done all over. So I think it's very important that we have very conscientious, responsible, sensitive architects and planners involved in this whole design process. And I would also add here that, the government especially needs to take the architects and planners more seriously. We are mostly left to design houses, and that's where people recognize us as architects who've done a good job of a house or maybe a building or something. But in the city, as far as the city is concerned, I think the role of leading architects is very, very important.
And it seems like we're talking about community architecture here as well. Am I correct, Mr. Asad?
Yes, we are, yes.
So how important is it to involve the community when we're in urban planning?
Well, we're not at that stage where we can involve our communities because that kind of participatory work is not very acceptable or not encouraged so much. We may like to talk about it, but it's not practically happening. But yes, theoretically, it's a good idea that we involve communities, but where are communities involved in decision making? There's no involvement of them at all. In fact, even architects and planners and all are not involved in the main decision making process. It's all, we only are dished out a certain set of requirements which we follow. We are never consulted really in that sense.
And what needs to be considered in town planning? Can you tell us about that, in your opinion?
Well, the cities, how they respond to people, I think there is a capacity issue at the moment in Pakistan also because people are not thinking in these lines. But unless the government encourages more and more architects as planners, because now urban planning is very much part of an architect's domain as well. And it's the architects who give the vision and do the creative one. So I think that is probably lacking at the moment.
And Mr. Asad, I want to understand in the global context, what global trends in terms of sustainable architecture can be adopted here? Because we were obviously talking about how traditional values need to be reverted back to, need to be understood more deeply. But with climate change and everything that's happening, what can we pick up from different countries?
I don't think we need to pick up anything from any other country. We should rely on our own senses and own sensitivities and our own culture and tradition. We've been relying too much, looking too much towards the West, and that's why we are in such a mess. Because we are totally out of line, out of sync with our lifestyle, with the way we live, the way we integrate with people, and the way we move around. So that is, so why do we need to go looking for notions that come from abroad? we have to adopt to our own thing. And that's what we missed out. And we are adopting to Western cultures, Western styles. And whereas our own style, our own tradition has been so rich. But again, I'll just come back to the bylaws. It's the bylaws today do not allow you to make buildings which will be, the ones that were earlier made or during the British period, during the Mughal period and earlier, which we call our vernacular architecture, the courtyards, the verandas and all. Today, your bylaws absolutely prohibit you in a way because of their restrictive nature that you cannot, it'll be very difficult to build a courtyard house today in Pakistan unless you have sufficient land or...
And Mr. Asad, I take your point there, but something I want to ask you is that we're talking about using our traditional values and sense in developing houses more effectively. Can you tell us about what things we need to adopt in our houses that can be eco-friendly?
Well, it's, architecture is pretty common sense, and that is pretty much lacking. And so we need to sharpen our common sense. And eco-friendly today, fact is, everything, energy efficiency, water conservation, all these things have become so important in architecture. But then at the moment today, your security concerns also completely alter the architectural paradigm, how our buildings and how our houses, people look at the security aspects. But eco-friendly, just bringing in nature in the building, addressing to the natural environment, less air conditioning, less lighting, all this is being encouraged. And I think conscientious architects are looking at these things. But then we also have a lot of, just copy-paste architects.
On that point, Mr. Asad, I'm also going to ask Mr. Kamil here a question. So we've been, Asad mentioned the bylaws and how that those are prohibiting us to develop architecture in a way that it was developed before. So my question now comes is, with our changing lifestyles and with the population increases, is it even practical to think that it's possible to reconcile traditional architecture with modern day needs?
Well, no. So what we need to change is our lifestyles. It's not the architecture that needs to change to suit our absurd, illogical, destructive lifestyles. The problem is our lifestyles, and that includes the way we make things, economy. And you were asking about what one can do to make it more eco-friendly. Just to reduce to the absolute minimum the use of any industrial process in the manufacture of components or the construction of buildings or servicing and heating them.
Mariam, do you share those same views?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot to learn from our traditional architecture. And these were times where, air conditioning was not there, heating was not there, and the buildings were the ones that were providing for the needs of the people living in them. So I think that they have very important lessons to offer, which we need to look into. We need to look into how those materials are better suited to our environment and whether we can create modern architecture or contemporary architecture of today using those materials. How they were structured, how their spacing was, how they were used to insulate, how they were used to bringing in more light, more air. All of those aspects. I think there needs to be research into this, and there needs to be an initiative from the architects of today that they make an effort to incorporate these lessons into today's architecture.
Definitely. And Mr. Asad, I just want to ask you a last question before we let you go, is what lessons need to be taught to the architects of the future?
Oh, that's a difficult question. Well, just have to be more aware of what is happening. They've got to realize how life is changing and how we need to adapt ourselves to it. I think that is something that has to be taught through our colleges also, our universities. Maybe that is also a bit lacking. We need to look at our curriculum that will inculcate this kind of thinking in the new generation that's coming up. We have a lot of architecture schools that are coming up in Pakistan. At the moment, there are about 37 of them. Can you imagine? And when we did our architecture, I remember Mr. Kamil Khan did, it was probably only one university. And at my time, we had only 3. So many architects are coming up. They need to be trained with ethics, ethical architecture. Then, of course, aesthetics is there, and the need of the times, and how we adapt ourselves to the changing times. I think that all is very important. But architects have to be recognized. We must be given our due recognition. There's very little recognition of architects. I'm so glad you're doing this program. Maybe people will understand that architects are the key factor in any development of a city, of a country, the development plans, the urban landscape, everything. Really, I think the lack of architecture in the decision-making process in the country has also led to the chaos and the mess that we see around and we live with in our daily lives,
Thank you so much, Mr. Asad Aya Khan, for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you. Mr. Kamil, something that Mr. Asad mentioned here was ethical architecture. And I'd like your views on it. What does he mean by that? What is it exactly?
Well, quite simply, you have to begin with the discernment. Discern between right and wrong. That's the first thing we need to do. And it's important to say this aloud because an aspect of postmodernist attitudes and positions philosophically is that there is no right and wrong. So if there is no right and wrong, if there is no absolute truth, if there is no, then you can't talk about ethics. Everything is all right.
So you first need to make sure that there is a right and wrong, and then you move on towards it. So how can ethical architecture be adopted?
It's by adopting this worldview, this mindset, this conviction that first of all there is an absolute reality, and against that you realize there is a right and a wrong. And once you realize that, that becomes a guidelines for every act that you do.
Yeah, that is a very insightful way to look at it. And Mariam, on that same point, how do you understand ethical architecture belonging to a younger generation of architects? Do you believe it's lacking? What do you see for the future?
I think generally just the way that this profession is practiced in this country, there needs to be a lot of improvement. And I don't think it's up to one person to make that change. I think as a community of architects, planners, designers, we need to make that change happen for us. And we need to look forward to a better future. And in order to do that, we need to understand better whatever was taught in our past and whatever lessons we've learned up until now. And then to create architecture that is in response to all of those things.
Yeah.
So I think it's definitely something that we as a community need to work to achieve, and it's not necessarily something one person can do.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Mariam, for joining us. Thank you so much, Mr. Kamil Mumtaz Khan, for joining us. Hope you liked today's show, and we'll see you again tomorrow.